So for a lot of reasons, I think theology is fighting for its life in some ways within the academy because it doesn't match these expectations of utility, materialism, and doesn't fit into the compartmentalized silo of a lot of contemporary teaching. Having said that, how do you preserve the animus and charism of a faith-based institution without theology?
So finally, landing this plane on this episode of Faith in Action, I really want to know about university life as a theology student. There's a lot of criticism toward university in general in the 21st century because of the availability of jobs that don't require and that they pay well, and maybe it's hard to get into university, spend the early years of your life dedicated to a study that you may not even use on a professional level. Why is theological education in the 21st century still pertinent for the vocational minister, whether they're a professor or a priest or a pastor or Bible teacher?
I think we live in a time where oftentimes we can't even agree on what is true and not true. And here we have a discipline in theology that ultimately is committed to discerning and trying to understand the truth and what is the truth. And so I think that in itself substantiates and justifies the ongoing need for theology, a discipline that is committed to critically reflecting upon the nature of truth and one in service to the truth. So I think that's one aspect of why theological education remains important. And then for me, also, one of the things that Christianity teaches us in so many ways, right? Whether it's explicit commandments or teachings, one cannot separate love of God from the love of neighbor, or in the incarnation of Jesus, right? Where do we find God? We find God in the one who suffers, right? And this is what the cross demonstrates to us. And so we live in a world in which human beings are suffering, and human beings could benefit from us loving them, being in relationship with them. And for us, it's a prerequisite. We cannot be in relationship with God without that. So theology and the study of theology also reminds us of our existential commitment, our commitment to our fellow human beings and to human beings who are suffering and through whom we can discover God, and to whom we can extend love and God too. And so I think for sure theology is necessary in terms of the critical thinking skills, its commitment to advocacy of truth, and its pastoral commitment to serving others, and particularly those who are suffering.
Well, moreover, as a theology professor, and we have the benefit of being in a faith-based institution, but in the case of, let's say, being at a state school, and you're a theology professor or a philosophical professor, is that position still tenable amongst the ranks of engineers and mathematicians and linguists and things that may have more direct, observable pertinence to society now? We get some social and liberal arts type of degrees receive a lot of skepticism, and sometimes it feels like theology can be pigeonholed into that because of its low numbers or its presumably low impact on society, especially as it becomes more secularized. So is that position of a theology professor, especially in a faith-based institution, how is that still impactful to students?
It's paradoxical, studying theology in our contemporary times and our contemporary culture, because, whether one's an engineer, a doctor, or a theologian, one would hope one is committed to truth and discovering what the truth is, and that one ultimately wants to put their discipline and the skills and their competency and their expertise at the service of other human beings. And you would hope that would be across all disciplines. And so it should be relevant and germane to all human beings, no matter what their discipline may be. But paradoxically, we also live in a culture, right, that defines things in terms of utility and in terms of materialism. And in comparison to a lot of other jobs and careers, I have a very rewarding and edifying job and career, and I've been able to support my family financially, but I'm not going to make the same amount of money as an electrical engineer, for example. So there is something different. And so we're fighting, we have competing forces at play in our culture, right? Where I think we all can see the value of discerning what the truth is and to serving other people, but we also live in a culture that puts a lot of pressure on us to be successful, and that defines success in terms of material wealth and well-being. And so theology then becomes under assault in a certain degree, because even though it's incredibly edifying and rewarding, it contributes to the search for truth, pastoral commitments to other, and can provide a healthy life for the theologian, it's not going to be perceived in the terms of utility and in terms of financial compensation that a lot of other secular careers are. And in many ways, not only is this a cultural type of materialism and utilitarianism that's operative in our culture, but we also live in a milieu in which education has become, in some ways, education unto testing and education unto select silos, compartmentalized silos. And I don't have anything against the other disciplines. I've taught in interdisciplinary programs, but I think we run the risk of really pigeonholing not only theology, but each other disciplines. And from a very young age, kind of directing young people towards a particular silo that doesn't allow them this type of interdisciplinary thinking. And so I think education itself has played into this. And so for a lot of reasons, I think theology is fighting for its life in some ways within the academy. Because it doesn't match these expectations of utility, materialism, and doesn't fit into the compartmentalized silo of a lot of contemporary teaching. Having said that, how do you preserve the animus and charism of a faith-based institution without theology? So it's indispensable for any institution that would be faith-based. And even within the secular state schools, it's an indispensable discipline as well. You think about the critical thinking skills that you develop, your ability to be an advocate for truth, the commitment to discern existential implications of whatever your discipline is, to put them in service of other human beings, whether that's motivated by faith, where in serving you, I'm serving God. Well, even if you don't have a faith perspective, you want to translate your competency, skill sets, and your gifts, right, to the person that you're trying to serve. I think that it's more needed now than ever, because I think in our public media and our public discourse, we've become so polarized that we can't even agree on what truth is, and we become so polarized that we're failing to see the common humanity of one another, and rather than respectfully agreeing to disagree, we're oftentimes vilifying the one who thinks differently than I do. I think theology has a lot to offer as a counterbalance to these type of dangerous tendencies to polarize unto vilifying, and a type of disavowal of truth under relativism.
And so for that next generation that's rising, the potential theologian of 2035 or whatever it may be in the distant future, how do you pour into them? Let's say you have two students, both theology majors. One is struggling to be disciplined, struggling to push through, really doesn't have an aptitude for study in general, but this is just something that they thought was the next step in their life. Versus student B, who has a great affinity for academics, who is hungry, who is looking for more. How do you identify and distinguish between the two? And then when you see someone with a lot of potential, how do you push them? How do you see that and not just hand out and say, hey, take it all and you never have to work or anything, but you push them to find answers for themselves, to not just repeat what they've read, but to internalize it and make their faith personal?
I know when I was a student, we used to say that half the battle was the teacher that you got, because the attitude and disposition of the teacher, their enthusiasm and passion for their discipline goes a long way, even if it's not my primary interest, right? There's a way in which their enthusiasm can be infectious. And I can tell you, being on the other side of the classroom as a professor, it goes the other way as well. That if the professor's half the battle, the students are half the battle as well. And so, and like you said, there's going to be different students with different degrees of affinity and interest in your discipline, and that's okay, right? And when you find those that do have a particular passion, interest, and enthusiasm, I think it is important to affirm that, to acknowledge that, to honor that, and then to encourage it, and to continue to use your own enthusiasm and passion to fuel that enthusiasm and passion that you see in the student. And then I think for me, relationships and mentoring were such a big part in my formative experience. I want to avail that to students. I want to offer that to them. I offer that to all of them. And those who have an affinity and shared passion, usually something then begins to unfold, much like in my relationship with you, right? And so once that relationship's born, then there's a way in which you can, on a more personal way, encourage and support that energy and passion, enthusiasm within the student, offer to help, to assist, try to challenge them to grow, either by reading more than what they may have read, directing them in new directions, challenging them to continue the level of scholarship they're doing or to pick it up some, to continue to challenge themselves, to affirm their own faith, but also allow themselves to be in the agitator cycle of the wash machine and let other people who think differently unsettle them and challenge them. And whether that could be ongoing conversations with me, literature they're reading, or me recommending, hey, you've had me as your teacher, now it's time to take this other teacher who thinks differently than I do and thinks differently than you do, and go dance the dance with them for a while. Yeah. Each one of those is a way in which once that relationship is there, and there's a trust there, and there's a respect there, where it's understood, I want to preserve that enthusiasm and that faith that's already there, but I want it to grow and to expand both critically as a scholar, but then spiritually unto your edification. Once that's there and there's a trust, then I think the student enters into that process more willingly and will do additional research, read a different book, take a different professor. There's a type of trust, and then be a sounding board when I think about what studies to do next, right? So I think what you do is you try to bring that forth out of every student. Inevitably, there's going to be a few where this is their calling, right? This is their vocation. And to the extent that that's reciprocated, right, that half comes back to you, then I think you trust the Spirit and allow that relationship then to mature to a different level. And once that trust is there, I think the student then will allow you to challenge them to grow and trust your judgments in terms of things that they ought to read or do in order to progress in their understanding and their journey.
Students who have taken that next step, who show that affinity for graduate studies and PhD program, maybe they have many affinities when it comes to theology, like Christology or ecclesiology or Hebrew scripture studies, church history, patristics, a variety. How do you help them narrow that down to one discipline, to where the world needs this right now, and it fluctuates, as you had mentioned. But how do we identify what the world needs, what they like, versus what they really need to pour into?
Well, I think that I would encourage one to hold a couple things in balance. First of all, there's something, right, that's the animus, that's the foundation, that's the basis of one's enthusiasm, one's passion, one's drive and commitment to want to study it at this level. That needs to be honored and that needs to be protected, because that's what's brought you to this point, right? So that's one piece, be faithful to that. But then there's also two layers of prudence, right? I need to get a job if I want to be a professional theologian or I want to teach.
Yeah.
And so part of that is, taking that core and being faithful to it, because first and foremost, you got to be faithful to yourself, but having some prudence to say, okay, what is the current landscape that may have provide greater opportunities in terms of employment in theology. So, for example, no matter how one may feel about issues of environmental, global warming and global change, environmental change, ecological and environmental theology, I think, is something that would be prudent to be aware of. In my own faith tradition, Pope Francis has written 2 major papers on the environment and our Christian understanding of stewardship and dominion over the created earth. I suspect as these issues continue to receive attention, both economically, socially, politically, the ability to be in conversation with such a pressing global issue of contemporary urgency and relevance, there'd be some prudence, right? And being aware and being able to put the discipline in conversation with environmental issues. Think of AI right now, this whole new realm of
Christian morality.
Morality, epistemology, the way we come to know things, human agency, human relationships in terms of contemporary social media and online connectivity. What does that mean for anthropology, how we understand the human person, relationships, human intimacy? So being able to take key theological principles and also have an eye towards some of these things that aren't going anywhere soon, like environmental issues, social media and communication technology issues, AI issues, and then even on a global stage. Earlier I had mentioned, post 9/11, having a Christian foundation, but being able to be in type of interreligious dialogue with Islam would have made a lot of sense. I think on the global stage, right? Wedding one's core belief, and for us it would be Christianity, with an ability to be in conversation with people of other religions, whether it be Judaism, given the United States relationship with Israel, whether it be Hinduism, given the increased economic ties between the United States and India on an international level. So I think there's a way in which you need to balance what it is that brought you to the point that you're at, and you need to honor that, because that's ultimately what's put you on fire. And then there's a prudential wisdom in saying, hey, I need to keep an eye on some other things that are going on that I can put theology in conversation with. That's only going to help my chance of having employment opportunities. And then I think the third is another type of observation. You were saying that human beings have needs, right? Part of it's being flexible enough to pivot to what the needs are being presented to you. So, for example, I share with you that it was God's providence, right, that kind of unfolded, that brought me to being a teacher. That's one thing. Once I got teaching, I had no idea that for 30 out of the 33 years I'd be teaching deacon candidates, right? But the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church in the 1960s, restored the permanent diaconate in my faith community. This created a whole need for men who are pursuing this particular vocation to be deacons in the church, to have studies. And so it just so happened that this was an aspect that the needs of the people presented themselves to me. So I take my interest in church, ecclesiology, and sacraments, and I say, okay, well, here's church, and one of the sacraments in my tradition is holy orders, when one is made a priest, right? And diaconate's ordained, that's holy orders too. It's a sacrament, right? So I take that interest in church and sacrament, but here's a brand new interest that my church has a need of, a human need. I need to respond to that. So part of it is, I think, all of that, right? Owning your passion, because that's what brought you to the point that you want to continue. Being prudent enough to know that, hey, theology jobs aren't a million. We got to be prudent about putting in conversation with other disciplines and other pressing contemporary issues. And then third, also being willing to pivot as the needs of the people present themselves to us. Take an aspect of what's important to us and we're passionate about and speak to that need as it presents itself to us. I'll give you an example. For me, this is kind of selfish and it's kind of more contained. My passion, the Second Vatican Council, ended in 1965. The key theologians that contributed to that are now dead. And theologians like me, who came along and was put on fire by them, there's more gray in my hair now than it was 33 years ago. The generation of theologians coming behind me in the Catholic tradition are not as committed to the council as I am. And that, to me, the council was a really important event and gift to the future of the church. I'm concerned that if there's not people committed to it, what happens to that vision? What happens to the spirit of that council? Right. And so that would be on a more selfish level. For me, one of the areas moving forward that I would hope some would be interested in.
Well, in considering that, so say if I want to go into Hebrew scripture studies and I want to learn Hebrew and a few modern languages and all the other requirements, would picking a correct institution make or break me? So for instance, I don't know, if I pick a state school to study Hebrew scriptures versus a highly religious institution, or even different denominations. Say I decide to go to Pentecostal school instead of a Catholic school. How instrumental is that to your development of your academic career and everything preceding that?
Right. You know, I think that, again, there's a type of prudence and balance that has to be reached, right? In the sense that one needs to prayerfully think about which institution is the best fit for them ultimately. Mm-hmm. And that's not cliche, I think that's authentic. Mm-hmm. And however, right, I shared earlier that the getting in part professionally is really hard. Mm-hmm. There's gonna be a lot of PhDs in theology competing for very few positions. And just the nature of human beings, even though I started with you need to pick the institution that most resonates to what you're being called to, I believe that. There's also a type of prudential realism. If you've got 150 applications on your desk, and I come from a Catholic tradition, okay? The University of Notre Dame, Boston College, Georgetown, these are institutions that their name visibility alone, right? When I'm cutting that 100 down to 50, the ones with Georgetown, Notre Dame, and Boston College will probably make it to the round of 50. Mm-hmm. Right? Just because of the name recognition of the institution. So that's just a reality. I'm not saying that's right, but that's a part of the reality. So how do you weigh sort of the value of institutional reputation versus your own sense of call? I think there's a lot of schools across the spectrum that can give you a quality education and prepare you, right? That may not have the same name recognition as like a Notre Dame or, right? For me, I turned down Notre Dame for a doctorate to choose Duquesne because it had a specialization in theology that spoke to me the most, and it was going to allow me to teach while I studied. Yeah. And so part of the discernment too is, and I don't have a magic formula, right? So I don't want to say, hey, name recognition doesn't matter at all, because I think that's just not truthful. It's just like we live in a society where, you know, a Lexus gets more attention than my Ford maybe, right? The same with certain people who are looking at applications. Some are going to be more sticker impressed than others. So I don't want to belittle that, but at the same time, one has to look inside themselves and saying which program feels the right fit for me. I think most of them are going to give you the skill set you need, but then are they going to give you the additional? Are they going to feed your faith as well as your mind? They can provide you not just with financial scholarship. Is it an assistantship where you're doing research for the professor, or is it an assistantship where you're asked to teach a class? And which one of those speak to you and do you feel called to? So I think it's a very personal decision. Mm-hmm. And I think it's trying to assess the value of each of those. My future marketability, depending on what institution I choose, how it's preparing me, and then the type of opportunity it's giving me, both in terms of my faith as well as my scholarly growth and opportunities even while I'm studying. I don't think there's a magic formula for it.
Well, lastly, for someone like myself who is not at the very beginning of this journey in theology, but maybe a third of the way through, maybe 45%, what advice would you give to myself, maybe someone younger? Put yourself in my shoes. What do you look back over the past 3+ decades of scholarship? What would you say, man, I really wish I would have known that 30 years ago?
I would encourage one to stick with it. I share with you, I was fortunate that each opportunity continued to present itself, and I was very, very blessed that way. But I think as you're younger and you have energy and you have less maybe family demands and whatnot, and financial demands, there's a way in which there's a freedom for the academic piece that comes in continuing that pursuit. So I would say I was lucky. I didn't necessarily know that; it just happened.
Yeah.
But if I were now looking back, I'd say stick to it, because as you get married and have kids and other financial demands, it becomes more difficult. And then 30 years down the road, I now have seen a lot of people that if they don't stick with it, they oftentimes don't see it through. And sometimes there's legitimate family or economic or other professional opportunities where their path goes somewhere else, and that's okay. But there's other people, I think, get off track who did have a legitimate vocation and for whatever reason didn't pursue it. So to the extent that you can remain consistent, committed, even if it's challenging, if it's difficult to do so, because I've seen people lose opportunities and not return. And then I think one other thing is, just like any other relationship, you're going to go through periods of greater and less intensity and zeal. And you're going to go through periods of in-loveness and not in-loveness, liking and not liking, just like any human relationship, right? Mm-hmm. How do you preserve that intimacy and be gentle with yourself as you go through periods where there's going to be highs, there's going to be lows, but hang in there. Because just like any other relationship that's worth it and is rooted in love and is meant to be vocational, as long as you remain faithful, you'll make it through. Just be prepared and expect the ebb and flow of the challenges that come.
Well, Dr. Tkacik, thank you so much for your time today.
You bet, Isaac. Thank you.
It's been incredible. It was a long time in the making, both as my professor and also setting up this thing. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thank you everyone for journeying with us through this talk on theology and being a professor at a university level teaching about God. I mean, it's been an incredible experience. I know it's something that I'm really interested in, and I hope this really helps someone out there. And we thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of Faith in Action. If you'd like to visit us in person, we have Sunday services at 10 a.m. and then we have Wednesday night Bible study for adults, and we also have Redemption Kids and youth as well to bring your children with you. So God bless, take care, we'll see you in the next one.